Good afternoon. Welcome to this week's episode of your Business with Acting Nominees. My name is Daniel Olukayode Adeyemo. Today we'll be looking at an overview of the Nigerian Startup Act. And if you're very much familiar with what happened recently, about a week or 2 weeks ago, we had an enactment of the new law, the Nigerian Startup Act. And all we'll be doing today is just to make you understand, all that pertains to your startup as far as this act is concerned. Before we go on, we've had previous sessions today, and I would advise you check it out for free because these are some of the things you actually get to consult for. So you can go to our Facebook page at Acting Nominees. You'll find all of the previous sessions we've had up to last year. Alright, so today we'll be looking at the Nigerian startup, but before we go into the Nigerian startup, I would like to lay a few background or introduction. So did you know that Nigeria is actually the leading startup company? I mean, Nigeria is the country with the leading amount of startups in the whole of Africa. Did you know that? And if you actually look at it, by virtue of certain reports we've had in the past, up to year 2020, we had a record of over 3,300 startups in Nigeria. Now, compared to the likes of South Africa, the likes of Kenya, Uganda, and all of those countries. Now, why I'm stating this is because we need to understand that within 2010 to 2018, we've had up to like 61% of failures in terms of startups that actually started and then they actually failed in the process. All right, so we need to bear this in mind as we go on because for me, I feel this act is more or less like an answer to the prayers of business leaders, business people in general. All right, so because there are provisions in this act that would that kind of like serve to cushion the what's the word? What word should I use? To cushion the some of the challenges that startups face in Nigeria. All right, so and when we look at okay, what do you think would have cost about 61% of Nigerian startups to have failed? When you look at it, you look at funding issues, and then you can also consider that the other bodies have actually tried to reduce all of this. We have the Tony Elumelu Foundation that came in. Of course, the foundation committed itself to actually submitting $100,000, or $100 million over the course of 10 years to train 10,000 businesses with the intention that it brings forth more jobs for people, which also aids the economy, right? But despite all of this, you can also see that so little has been done in a way because there's only little they can do. So the need for the government to actually come into place, to actually collaborate with some of these private institutions, to make things even much better is very important. All right, so why do you think I consider the fact that the Nigerian Startup Act is a step in the right direction? One thing is that we need to look at our predecessors. Now, we have countries like Italy, we have countries like Tunisia that have actually adopted this act in the past, not so even long from now. For example, Italy, between the year 2012 to 2015 of adopting the Startup Act, they've actually received up to like 34 million euros in worth of investment within their ecosystem. Now, for Tunisia, which is not even so far from us in North Africa here, within 2019, they actually brought in the Startup Act in 2019, and within that year 2019, they were able to record over $24.4 million worth of investment in their ecosystem. All right. So for me, I feel this the enactment of this act is a step in the right direction. Obviously, our leaders are conscious of what is going on in other systems, and then bringing in this act is a step in the right direction. But beyond that, implementing this act is the most important. All right, so moving on, we're just looking at the objective. So before I actually even move on, this overview, this exposition is quite broad. So because of want of time, we'll be dividing it into two. So this week we'll be taking the first part, and then next week we'll be taking the remaining part of this presentation. But then the whole essence of this, like I would always say, is that implementation is key, in terms of, all of this. So this is not just to come and just talk about what has happened, what is recent, but then the most important thing, if we're actually going to reap the benefits of some of these laws, is to do what is stated therein. All right, so Talking about the objective of the act as well as the application, one is to provide an enabling environment for the establishment, development, and operation of startups in Nigeria. So one thing we can say from, I think, from the past up till now is that our startup ecosystem has been plagued with various challenges, from funding, like I mentioned, to talent, not enough talent to actually come together in the workforce, and several other issues like that. But going through these provisions over last week, I came to realize that some of the provisions are kind of geared towards solving all of these issues. But then, like I said, implementation is also key. All right. We also have to provide legal and institutional frameworks for the development of startups in Nigeria. We also have to provide for development and growth of technology-related talent. So in this situation, there's a particular one which we'll be looking at next week, where they actually made provisions for, should I say, training of staff. All right. So training of staff, and one thing I saw in that provision, which I don't think I should even go into it right now, but we'll be looking at it next week. But the most important thing here is that there's an avenue for the training and for the development of employees in tech-related startups. And I think I should mention before going forward that by startup we're talking about tech-enabled startups. All right, but I'll be stating a little bit of that as we go further. All right, so another is to help position our startup ecosystem as the leading technology center in Africa. So currently, South Africa is actually the leading, is the country with the leading, should I say, the most developed ecosystem as far as startup is concerned, in Africa. Then we also have Kenya, with Nigeria coming third. So, but in spite of all of this, you can say, okay, Nigeria is the third leading, but we still have our issues. And hopefully, with the enactment of this particular law, things will be made better. All right. So I should also state this. Now, this act applies to all companies incorporated under the Companies and Allied Matters Act, and granted the startup label. So now, unlike before, by virtue of the enactment of this law, unlike before when we used to have, okay, this one is a startup, you can easily call someone a company, a newly formed company, a startup. Now you need to get the label, and I'll be looking at this in this same presentation today. So there are conditions you need to fulfill in order to be qualified to be labeled a startup. So it doesn't come automatically like it used to be before. Now you need to actually apply for it and get it. All right, so moving forward, let's look at the establishment and the roles of the council and its secretariat. So let's not forget that the goal of this act is accomplished when we have systems and processes in place, to drive the realization of this act. And the act in question now does establish the National Council for Digital Innovation and Entrepreneurship. So I call this NCDI. This is the council which drives for the realization of the provisions of this act, and we'll be looking at some of the roles, some of the functions, some of the things it seeks to do in order to achieve the realization of the provisions of this act. We also have the National Information Technology Development Agency, the NITDA, which also serves as the secretariat of the council, and we'll also be looking at the, some of the duties very shortly. Now, for the council, we are formulating and providing general policy guidelines for the realization of the act. General policy guidance to ensure that the act is put in place, is better realized. We also have given overall direction for the harmonization of laws and regulations that affect startups. And you would agree with me that prior to now, we've had various laws that affect startup in a way. All right. So what they seek to do is to avoid clashing of regulations here and there. So they seek to ensure that there is harmony so that when implementing a particular provision of a particular law, it doesn't contrast with another provision of a different law entirely. All right, so that's that. We also have ensuring the monitoring and evaluation of the framework to encourage the development of startups in Nigeria. All right, so on the part of the NITDA, I'm sure if you're very much current, you know that NITDA is not a new body in Nigeria. All right, so NITDA was created just to drive policies towards the digital economy, in general. And for me, I consider it wise on the part of those who drafted this law to have brought them in the first place. All right. So now, like I said, other than bringing in, other than establishing a different body to come and serve as, because majorly, like I said, NITDA being the secretariat, their main role is to implement the provisions of this act. So this implementation comes in diverse forms, which we'll be looking at, subsequently. All right. So now, in addition to the original duty of NITDA in developing programs and policies that drive the growth of startups, tech-enabled startups in Nigeria, they've been given added responsibilities by virtue of the enactment of this act, the Nigerian Startup Act. So we have the secretariat to collaborate with other existing MDAs, that is ministries, departments, and agencies, in order to promote innovation in digital technology and enterprise development in the Nigerian startup ecosystem. So there's a form of collaboration, there's a form of partnership, going on here. So ordinarily, you think that, okay, for a law created like this, probably the government is just going to work with the little body they've created to just get something out there. But no, one thing they've come to realize, and one of my mentors would usually say something that for us to actually reach a point of economic sustainability in whatever level, we need to embrace partnership. All right, so this is one thing that I believe the act is actually put into place, because here we can see the federal government coming together with, although the ministries still form the government, but then departments and agencies, even private bodies are not left out. And of course, in order to even bring them in to develop the startup ecosystem, there are incentives given to them, but we'll be looking at some of those incentives next week. Alright, so we also have the secretariat to create a startup portal which will serve as a platform for registering the relevant MDAs, that is ministries, departments and agencies, to be manned by a coordinator with at least 10 years experience, at least 10 years experience in technology and entrepreneurship. Alright, so one thing I can also point out here is that the portal, every establishment would usually have a portal where you can carry out certain registrations. So the Nigerian Startup Act is not left out in this regard. Alright, so I should also give an example to make this even much more clear. We talk about the issue of the collaboration between the federal government, the ministries and departments and agencies. We know examples of ministries. We have the Ministry for, let's say, Industry, Trade and Investment, right? And if you're very much familiar with IP law, you would know that when it comes to registering your trademark, it's more or less one of the ministries you need to engage with, you need to interface with. So the portal is now creating a platform where you can actually easily register. And there's more to this anyway, because if, for example, now you have a business and you're trying to register your IP, or you're trying to bring an action against another body that's infringed on your IP, on your intellectual property rights, or you're trying to register beyond the border of Nigeria. So this portal has created a platform for you to actually achieve that. Alright, so we also have, with the approval of the council, the secretariat shall set up a consultative body called the Startup Consultative Forum, on the portal to help facilitate information sharing and collaboration involving the federal government, liaising with industry stakeholders and representatives registered on the platforms such as labeled startup, venture capitalists, angel investors, and all of those bodies. So like I said earlier, collaboration is still key, partnership is still key, and they've realized this and they've put it into the law. So kudos to those who drafted the law, despite the fact that, in my opinion, I still see some lapses here and there, although which is not for the course of this presentation. Alright, so and let's not forget the fact that all of these duties on the part of the council, on the part of NITDA, the secretariat, everything is still driving towards accomplishing the intent of this act. Alright, another is to maintain the directory of startups, incubators and accelerators. So we need to understand that in the course of registering startups, unlike before, I mentioned something earlier about the fact that prior to this act, once you register a company, a limited liability company, or people just call it a startup. But this time around, what they are trying to accomplish now is that you need to register. And before you can actually go through the registration stage, you need to actually fulfill some of the conditions that are already stated. So you need to fulfill those conditions. Once those conditions are fulfilled, you're given a license for a period of 10 years. Alright? You enjoy that label as a startup, after which you renew and then you renew, subsequently. Alright, so and why am I even saying this? In the course of registering, of course, they would have to maintain a registry, a directory of startups that have been registered. And of course, I would advise that you take advantage of this, because the incentives, you can't even believe it when you go to the provision. So what we can just hope for is that these things be implemented. So once you have the once you are labeled as a startup, you would enjoy these benefits 100%. So hopefully when they implement it though. Alright, so now, like I said, unlike before when we would say, okay, this is a startup, you just created a company with your startup. Now you need to get a label. What is a startup according to this? So if you've been following what I've been saying, I don't think I even mentioned it anyways. For you to qualify as a startup, you need to have been in business for not more than 10 years, that is 10 years and below. Alright, so below 10 years you need to have been operating as a startup to qualify to be labeled a startup, and you need to be tech enabled. And for me, I think in this day and age, we need technology for virtually everything. Depending on regardless of the industry you find yourself, is it agriculture, is it health, is it insurance, is it media, name it, finance, technology plays its role in all of these industries. So these industries, I will call them, they are generally tech enabled. So as long as you fall within this, this category, you will ordinarily enjoy enjoy the label. You would be entitled to get the label as a startup. Alright, so now let's look at some of the conditions you need to fulfill. And before I move on, I would like to state something. Remember when I was actually talking about all of this, I mentioned limited liability company. So you need to understand that generally under the CAC, when you want to register an entity in general, you can either register as a business name, a company, or incorporated trustee, right? And by virtue of this Startup Act, if you fall under business name, if you fall under incorporated trustee, it's possible, actually it's not that it's possible, you won't qualify to get the label as a startup. So you need to be a company. And then of course there are further requirements before you can even get the label. So, but one thing this act has done is, especially for business name, because ordinarily it is easier for a business name to transition into becoming a company. Alright, so for a business name, if you are interested in being labeled as a startup, what you need to do is just to apply to the secretariat. And in applying to the secretariat, we look at some of the conditions which we'll be looking at very, very shortly. And once you fulfill those, once you go towards fulfilling those conditions, you will be labeled as a startup. So, but one thing should be also noted here, and that's the fact that before you are granted that label as a startup, you would be given 6 months. Should I call it pre-label, or do you pre-labeled a startup within 6 months? That is, you would enjoy that label for 6 months, prior to which they would expect you would have complied with all of the conditions which we'll be looking at very shortly. So once you fulfill all of those conditions, you would enjoy the label of a startup, and of course all the incentives that comes with it. So some of the criteria that you need to fulfill to be labeled as a startup include that you must be registered as a limited liability company under CAMA, and you must have been operating for not more than 10 years, which already stated. Its objects are innovation, development, production, improvement, and commercialization of a digital technology, innovative product or process. How I would explain this in very simple terms is that you use technology, you employ technology in all you do. Probably you use apps in terms of the services you provide, in terms of the product. You have to ensure that whatever it is you're doing is technology enabled. And we also have, it must be a holder repository of a product or process of a registered software. You operate a software. I don't know if I should give an example. Under the travel industry, we have Uber, right? We they use in tracking progress. So ultimately, they qualify under this, provided they've not exceeded 10 years. So that's just like an example. There are multiple examples you can also check. So another is that it has at least 1/3 local shareholding held by one or more Nigerians as founder or co-founder. So they're trying to encourage, Nigerian ownership for it to, benefit from these as well. All right. In the case of sole proprietorship or partnership, like we already stated before, it satisfies the three preceding conditions. That is, you must have been registered as a limited liability company and you must not have exceeded 10 years. Your object must tend towards innovation and must be technology enabled. Must be a holder or repository of a product or process that is also technology enabled, like having a registered software, and that. So I would just state in general that this is more or less like a break, should I say. We've gone halfway in terms of all that this act entails, so there is more which we'll be looking at next week. And I would just advise that we try to implement all of these provisions that have been stated. And one thing we should just hope for is that these laws are implemented, because I know if these laws are implemented, it would be a turnaround for the Nigerian startup ecosystem. And aside from the government actually fulfilling this role, also we should, on our part, as business people, try to align with all of these things, and would get the best of of this act. Like I stated, being labeled as a startup comes with its own incentives. There are multiple incentives, especially for people that are actually even coming in to should I say, support entrepreneurs in general. They are given incentives, so it's more or less like it welcomes foreign investment, even investment within Nigeria and within Africa. So all I can say is that I think it's a right step in the right direction, even though over the years subsequently we'll be having amendments here and there, because I see calls for amendment in a few areas. So thank you for joining us on this week's session, on this week's episode of Your Business with Axiom Minis.